When 6-year-old Connor Martinez stood in the checkout line at a Safeway in suburban Phoenix on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, clutching a bag of gummy bears while the blonde woman beside him paid for groceries, he did something that required more courage than most adults could summon. He looked directly at the cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, and said in a voice just loud enough to be heard over the beeping scanner, "My real mom has brown hair." The woman with him, who'd introduced herself to the cashier as Connor's aunt taking him shopping while his mother was at work, went very still for just a fraction of a second before her smile returned, a bit too bright, a bit too forced. The cashier, whose name was Linda Vasquez, and who'd worked that register for 17 years, felt something cold settle in her stomach because she'd seen enough scared kids in her time to know the difference between a child being silly and a child trying to send a message. What happened in the next 4 minutes, before that blonde woman could finish paying and walk Connor out of the store and into a white Honda Accord that would disappear into Phoenix traffic, would turn an ordinary grocery run into a missing child recovery, expose a custody violation that had crossed state lines, and prove that sometimes the smallest acts of attention from strangers are what stand between a child and disaster. The Safeway on East Camelback Road in Phoenix was the kind of neighborhood grocery store where people shopped after work, where the parking lot filled up around 5 in the evening with families grabbing dinner ingredients and retirees picking up prescriptions. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, the Arizona sun still brutal even in late September, heat shimmering off the asphalt outside while inside the store, air conditioning kept everything at a comfortable 72 degrees. Linda Vasquez had been working Register 3 since 2 that afternoon, scanning items with the kind of automatic efficiency that came from doing the same motion thousands of times. She was 53 years old, a grandmother of 4, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the patient, observant demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with the public. She noticed things, details that other people missed, because working a checkout line meant watching humanity pass by in small increments, seeing patterns in behavior, reading moods in body language. The blonde woman had approached her register with a cart containing what looked like road trip supplies: bottled water, granola bars, a couple of sandwiches from the deli, chips, juice boxes, a road atlas even though most people use GPS now, and one small bag of gummy bears that the little boy beside her was holding like a prize. The woman was maybe 35, attractive in a generic way, with shoulder-length blonde hair that looked professionally colored, expensive sunglasses pushed up on her head, and an outfit that suggested she had money. Designer jeans, a silk blouse, leather sandals that probably cost more than Linda made in a week. She smiled at Linda with the kind of polite friendliness that said she was used to being liked, used to being trusted. The boy was something else entirely. He was small for what Linda guessed was probably 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting, brown eyes that seemed too serious for his age, and skin a few shades darker than the blonde woman's, suggesting different ethnic backgrounds. He wore cargo shorts and a faded Diamondbacks t-shirt that looked like it had been through the wash too many times, and his sneakers had scuff marks on the toes. Nothing about his appearance matched the woman's polished presentation, and while that alone didn't mean anything, families came in all configurations. There was something in the way he stood beside her that made Linda's trained eye pause. The boy wasn't holding her hand. He wasn't leaning against her the way kids usually did with parents or close relatives. He was standing very still, very separate, like he was trying not to draw attention while simultaneously hoping someone would notice him. Linda started scanning items, making the kind of small talk that cashiers made to pass the time. The woman explained with an easy laugh that she was Connor's aunt, that his mother was stuck at work with a project deadline, and that she'd offered to take him for the afternoon, maybe get him out of the house for a bit. She said it smoothly, naturally, the kind of explanation that would satisfy most people's casual curiosity. Linda nodded and smiled and kept scanning, but she was watching the boy. Connor hadn't smiled once. He hadn't looked up at the woman when she mentioned his mother. He just kept staring at the gummy bears in his hands, his small fingers gripping the bag with a tension that seemed excessive for a kid holding candy. Linda scanned the gummy bears last, the ones Connor was holding, and she made eye contact with him when she reached for them. The boy looked up at her, and Linda saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from being scolded or getting in trouble, but something deeper, something that made his gaze dart quickly to the blonde woman and then back to Linda, like he was checking to see if it was safe to speak. And then he said it, his voice quiet but clear, deliberately measured like he'd been practicing the words in his head. My real mom has brown hair. The blonde woman's smile froze for just a heartbeat before she laughed, a sound that was meant to convey amused exasperation but came out slightly too sharp. Oh, Connor, we talked about this, sweetie. Your mom asked me to take you shopping, remember? You're being silly. But Connor didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He looked at Linda with an intensity that no 6-year-old should have to possess and said again, My real mom has brown hair. She doesn't have yellow hair like this lady. She has brown hair like me. Linda felt her pulse quicken. She'd worked retail long enough to know when something was wrong, and every instinct she'd developed over 17 years was screaming at her now. The woman's body language had changed. Her smile was still there, but her shoulders had tensed. Her hand had moved toward Connor's arm in a way that looked like it might become a grip, and her eyes had gone from friendly to calculating in the space of a breath. Linda made a decision that would either save a child or make her look like a paranoid fool who'd caused a scene over nothing. She reached under her register and pressed the small button that signaled for a manager, the one they were supposed to use for price checks or customer complaints, but that Linda had never pressed in a non-routine situation until this exact moment. The blonde woman noticed the movement, noticed Linda's hand going under the counter, and her expression shifted immediately. Is there a problem? Her voice had an edge now, the friendliness gone, replaced by something harder. Linda kept her own voice calm, professional, the tone she'd use for any normal transaction. Just need a quick authorization, ma'am. Computer's flagging something. Won't take but a minute. She made eye contact with Connor again, gave him a small nod that she hoped conveyed you did the right thing. I'm listening. And then looked back at the woman whose face had gone pale beneath her makeup. The manager, a balding man in his 40s named Tom Reeves, who'd worked at this Safeway for 9 years, approached the register with the slightly hurried walk of someone who'd been pulled away from inventory counts. Linda met his eyes and said quietly, Tom, I need you to call the police. Right now. She didn't look at the blonde woman when she said it, kept her gaze on Tom, and saw understanding dawn in his face, even if he didn't know the specifics yet. Tom had worked with Linda long enough to trust her judgment, had hired her himself, and knew she wasn't the kind of person who panicked over nothing. The blonde woman's reaction confirmed everything Linda had suspected. She grabbed Connor's arm, a grip that made the boy wince, and started backing away from the register. We're leaving. This is ridiculous. I don't have to stand here and be accused of... She didn't finish the sentence, just yanked Connor toward the exit, moving fast. Linda called out, loud enough for other customers to hear. That boy just said she's not his mother. Someone stop her. The words cut through the ambient noise of the store, through the background music and the chatter and the beeping of other registers, and several people turned to look. A man in the produce section, broad-shouldered and wearing a construction company t-shirt, stepped into the aisle between the blonde woman and the door. A teenager stocking shelves pulled out his phone and started recording. The woman in line, behind them, a middle-aged lady with a concerned expression, moved to block the other exit path. The blonde woman stopped, realizing she was surrounded by people who'd been alerted to a potential problem, people who were now watching her, people with phones out, and her face went from pale to red with what looked like anger but might have been panic. This is a misunderstanding, she said, her voice rising. This child is my nephew. His mother asked me to watch him. You have no right to, but Tom was already on the phone, speaking quickly to emergency dispatch, giving the store address, describing the situation. Linda walked around the register and knelt down next to Connor, who was still being held by the blonde woman, but looked at Linda with desperate hope. Connor, honey, what's your full name? Linda kept her voice gentle, the same tone she used with her own grandchildren. The boy's voice trembled, but he answered clearly. Connor James Martinez. My mom is Elena Martinez, and she works at a hospital, and she has brown hair, and this lady isn't my aunt. The blonde woman tried to pull him away, but the construction worker stepped closer, not threatening, just present, his bulk making it clear she wasn't leaving. "Ma'am, you should wait for the police," he said evenly. "If there's a misunderstanding, they can clear it up, but you're not taking this kid anywhere until they get here." Sirens were audible in the distance, growing closer. The blonde woman's expression went through several transformations in the span of seconds, anger giving way to calculation, giving way to something that looked like resignation. She released Connor's arm and took a step back, and Connor immediately moved to Linda's side, pressing against her leg like he was trying to make himself small. Linda put a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture meant to convey safety. "You're okay now, I've got you," and felt him relax just slightly under her touch. 2 Phoenix PD patrol cars pulled into the parking lot less than 3 minutes after Tom's call, officers emerging with the controlled urgency of cops responding to a possible child endangerment situation. They entered through the automatic doors, took in the scene, the blonde woman standing alone looking cornered, the small boy pressed against a cashier, the crowd of customers watching with a mix of concern and curiosity, and immediately separated the parties. One officer, a woman in her 30s with sergeant stripes, approached Connor and Linda while her partner detained the blonde woman for questioning. The sergeant knelt down to Connor's level, her voice calm and professional. "Hi there, buddy. My name is Sergeant Ruiz. Can you tell me what's going on?" Connor looked at Linda first, like he was checking for permission, and Linda gave him an encouraging nod. He looked back at Sergeant Ruiz and said in a small voice, "That lady took me from my school. She said my mom sent her, but my mom didn't. She said we were going on a trip, but I don't want to go with her. I want my mom." The sergeant's expression tightened, her hand going to her radio. She asked Connor for his mother's name, his school, his address, details that the boy provided with the kind of specificity that made it clear he was telling the truth. Sergeant Ruiz radioed for additional units and for someone to contact Elena Martinez immediately. The blonde woman was insisting she had legal custody documentation, that this was a family matter, that Connor's mother had given her permission, but her story had inconsistencies that became more apparent the more she talked. The officers separated her from Connor completely, moving her outside to one of the patrol cars while they verified information. Tom pulled security footage showing the woman arriving at the store with Connor 20 minutes earlier, the boy walking beside her with his head down, his body language nothing like a kid on a fun outing with a relative. Within 10 minutes, they had confirmation from Connor's elementary school that he'd been picked up at 2:30 that afternoon by a woman claiming to be his aunt, someone who'd provided identification that matched a name on the emergency contact list. But when they called Elena Martinez at the hospital where she worked as a surgical nurse, she told them in a voice that went from confused to terrified in seconds that she didn't have a sister, that no one had permission to pick up her son, that Connor should be at after-school care until she got off shift at 6. She said the name on the emergency contact list, Melissa Grant, was her ex-husband's new wife, that there was a custody order in place that specifically prohibited any contact, and that Melissa had made threats during the divorce about taking Connor to teach Elena a lesson. The blonde woman in the parking lot was Melissa Grant, and what had looked like an innocent shopping trip was actually a parental kidnapping in progress, a custody violation that had crossed state lines because Melissa lived in California with Connor's biological father who'd lost custody rights after a domestic violence conviction. She'd apparently been planning to drive Connor to California, to her husband, and to disappear into a legal battle that would have traumatized the boy and potentially kept him from his mother for months or years. But she hadn't counted on Connor being brave enough to speak up, hadn't counted on a cashier being observant enough to notice fear in a child's eyes, and hadn't counted on a grocery store full of ordinary people being willing to act when a kid needed help. Elena Martinez arrived at the Safeway 17 minutes after being notified, having left the hospital mid-shift, driving through Phoenix traffic with the kind of desperate speed that comes from being told your child was almost taken. She ran into the store and found Connor sitting in the manager's office with Linda and Sergeant Ruiz, drinking a juice box and explaining very seriously to the officer how he'd known to say something, because his mom had always told him that if anything ever felt wrong, if anyone ever made him uncomfortable or tried to take him somewhere he didn't want to go, he should tell an adult he trusted, even a stranger, because good people would help. When Connor saw his mother come through the door, his composure broke. He ran to her and she caught him and held him, and they both cried, while Linda watched from a respectful distance, her own eyes burning. Elena looked at Linda over Connor's head, her face streaked with tears, and mouthed, "Thank you," with such profound gratitude that Linda felt something crack open in her chest. Elena carried Connor over to where Linda stood, still holding him close, and said in a voice that shook, "You saved my son. That woman was going to take him, and I might never have gotten him back, and you believed him when he told you something was wrong. I don't know how to thank you for that." Linda, who'd never thought of herself as heroic, who'd just been doing her job and paying attention, felt tears slide down her own face. "Well, he's a brave kid," she said quietly. "He knew something was wrong, and he spoke up. I just listened." The Phoenix Police Department spent the next several hours piecing together exactly how close Connor had come to disappearing. Melissa Grant had been planning the abduction for 3 weeks, ever since a judge had denied her husband's appeal for custody modification. She'd created a fake identity as Connor's maternal aunt, complete with forged documents that she'd used to get herself added to the school's emergency contact list by claiming to be helping Elena with childcare. She'd studied Elena's work schedule, learned when Connor would be at after-school care, and chosen a Wednesday afternoon when she knew Elena would be in surgery and unreachable for hours. The plan had been to pick Connor up from school, drive straight to California on Interstate 10, and deliver him to his father before anyone realized what had happened. By the time Elena got off work and discovered Connor missing, they would have been across state lines with a 6-hour head start, and the legal complications of interstate custody disputes would have made recovery difficult and traumatic. But Melissa hadn't accounted for the fact that Connor remembered his father, remembered the fights and the fear, and the reasons his mother had fought so hard for sole custody. She hadn't accounted for Elena being the kind of mother who taught her 6-year-old son that asking for help was smart and brave, not weak or tattling. And she certainly hadn't accounted for Connor having the presence of mind to look at a cashier he'd never met before and state a simple fact: "My real mom has brown hair." That would unravel everything. The detectives who interviewed Connor later that evening, with Elena present and a child psychologist observing, were impressed by how clearly he could articulate what had happened. He explained that the woman had picked him up from school and told him his mom was in an accident and needed him to come right away. But Connor knew that if there was a real emergency, his mom would call him herself or send Miss Patricia from next door, who sometimes watched him. He knew something felt wrong when the woman wouldn't let him call his mom, when she told him to be quiet and not make a scene, when she drove in the opposite direction from the hospital. Connor said he'd tried to tell a man at a gas station when they stopped for bathroom breaks, but the man had just smiled and waved and not understood that Connor was trying to signal distress. He'd tried to catch the eye of a woman in a parking lot, but she'd been on her phone and hadn't looked at him. By the time they got to the grocery store, Connor had been with Melissa for over 2 hours and was terrified that no one would ever understand what he was trying to communicate. But he'd kept trying because his mother had told him to never give up asking for help, that eventually someone would listen. And when he saw Linda at that register, saw her kind face and the way she really looked at him, not just glanced past him the way adults often did with children, he decided to try one more time. He'd said the simplest, truest thing he could think of, a fact that would immediately signal something was wrong to anyone who was paying attention. "My real mom has brown hair." It was a statement designed to create cognitive dissonance, to make an observant person pause and question the situation, and it had worked. Linda Vasquez became something of a local hero over the following days, though she insisted she'd just been doing what anyone should do, paying attention and trusting her instincts when something felt wrong. News outlets ran the story with headlines about the cashier who saved a kidnapped child, and the Safeway corporate office sent representatives to commend her actions. But the attention made Linda uncomfortable. She gave one interview to a local news station, mostly because Elena asked her to, because Elena wanted people to know that ordinary citizens could make a difference in child safety. Linda sat in front of a camera and said simply that children deserve to be heard, that adults need to really look at kids and notice when something's wrong, and that it costs nothing to take a child's concern seriously, even if it turns out to be a misunderstanding. She said that Connor had been incredibly brave to keep trying to get help even when people weren't listening, and that his courage had saved his own life. The interview went viral, shared thousands of times across social media, and suddenly Linda's message about paying attention to children was reaching people far beyond Phoenix. Parents started conversations with their kids about what to do if they ever felt unsafe. Teachers incorporated stranger danger discussions that emphasized it was okay to ask any adult for help in genuine emergencies, and schools began reviewing their pickup procedures to prevent similar incidents. The Safeway where Linda worked put up a poster in the break room that read in bold letters, "Notice, believe, act." It became an informal motto for employees, a reminder that their role in the community extended beyond scanning groceries. Elena Martinez and Connor became regular visitors to that Safeway, stopping by to see Linda at least once a week. Connor would bring drawings he'd made at school, pictures of superheroes and grocery stores and cashiers with capes, and Linda would tape them up near her register where she could see them during her shifts. Elena brought flowers and thank you cards and offers to take Linda to dinner, anything to express a gratitude that felt impossible to adequately convey. Linda accepted the flowers and the cards but declined the dinners, insisting that seeing Connor safe and happy was all the thanks she needed. But she did agree to attend Connor's 7th birthday party 2 months later, held at a park near Elena's house with balloons and cake and a small group of Connor's friends from school. At the party, Connor stood on a picnic table bench and announced to everyone assembled that Miss Linda was his hero, that she'd saved him from a bad person, and that when he grew up, he wanted to be someone who helped people the way she did. He presented her with a construction paper card he'd made at school, decorated with stickers and glitter that said in careful first-grade handwriting, "Thank you for seeing me when I needed help. You are the best." Elena stood beside Linda while Connor made his announcement, and she said quietly, "He has nightmares sometimes about that day, about what could have happened if you hadn't listened. But he also talks about you constantly, about how you believed him, and his therapist says that having a positive adult figure who validated his fear and acted to protect him is helping him process the trauma. You gave him more than safety that day. You gave him proof that the world has good people in it who will help when he needs them." Linda thought about that a lot in the months that followed, about how one moment of attention had cascaded into something so much larger than a prevented kidnapping. She thought about all the times she'd seen kids in her checkout line who seemed uncomfortable or scared or wrong somehow, and how she'd dismissed it as kids being kids, as not her business, as probably nothing. She thought about how easy it would have been to ignore Connor's statement, to laugh it off the way Melissa had tried to avoid the potential awkwardness of questioning an adult's relationship to a child. And she thought about how close Connor had come to disappearing because 6 other adults that day had looked away, had been too busy or too uncomfortable or too trusting to intervene. She started paying attention differently after that, not just at work, but everywhere. She noticed things she'd been blind to before, saw patterns in how children behaved around adults, learned to read the microsignals that indicated comfort versus fear. She intervened twice more in the following year, once when a teenager in her line seemed to be sending signals of distress about the man she was with, and once when a young girl's body language with her supposed babysitter felt wrong. Both times turned out to be legitimate concerns, one a trafficking situation and one a custody violation similar to Connor's case. Both times, Linda's willingness to act and ask questions led to intervention and safety. And both times she thought about a 6-year-old boy with brown eyes who'd been brave enough to keep asking for help until someone finally listened. The Phoenix Police Department asked Linda to speak at a community awareness event about child safety, and she agreed because Elena encouraged her to share what she'd learned. Linda stood in front of 200 people at a community center and talked about the importance of really seeing children, of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, of being willing to cause a scene or look foolish if there's even a chance a child needs help. She said that predators and abductors count on bystanders being too polite or too uncertain to intervene, that they rely on social conventions that make people uncomfortable questioning authority or family relationships. She said the best weapon against child endangerment was a community of adults willing to pay attention and act. Connor attended that event with his mother, sitting in the front row wearing a shirt that said, "Be brave, ask for help." And when Linda finished speaking, he stood up and started clapping, and the entire room joined him in a standing ovation. After the event, a woman approached Linda with tears in her eyes and said that 10 years earlier, her daughter had been abducted from a mall, that the girl had tried to signal for help to multiple adults and that no one had intervened. Her daughter had been recovered 3 days later, traumatized but alive, and the mother said she'd spent a decade wondering why no one had helped, why no one had noticed. She thanked Linda for being the kind of person who did notice, who did help, and for teaching others to do the same. Stories like that reinforced for Linda that Connor's rescue hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of children trying desperately to be seen and heard by adults who were too distracted or too unwilling to act. She thought about all the Connors in the world who didn't get lucky, who mouthed silent pleas that went unnoticed, who gave up trying because no one ever listened. And she committed herself to being someone who would always listen, who would always notice, who would always trust a child's fear, even if it meant risking embarrassment or confrontation. 5 years after that Wednesday afternoon at the Safeway, Connor was 11 years old, thriving in school, active in soccer and art classes, and working with his mother to create a program for elementary schools about recognizing unsafe situations and asking for help. The program included age-appropriate lessons about trusting your instincts, identifying safe adults to approach in emergencies, and understanding that being polite was less important than being safe. Connor and Elena presented the program to school districts across Arizona, and Connor would tell his story with remarkable composure for someone his age, explaining how he'd tried 6 times to get help before someone finally listened, and how that experience taught him that persistence matters, that you never stop asking until someone hears you. Linda attended one of those presentations, watching from the back of a school auditorium as Connor stood on stage and told several hundred elementary school children that the cashier who'd saved him hadn't been a police officer or a superhero, just a regular person who'd been paying attention. He told them that anyone could be that person for someone else, that noticing when something feels wrong and being willing to speak up or act could save a life. He told them that his mom had taught him to be brave and ask for help, and that Miss Linda had taught him that asking works, that there are people watching who will help if you can just get their attention. After the presentation, a second grader approached Connor with a question. What if no one believes you? What if you try to tell someone and they don't listen? Connor looked at the child with understanding and said something that stayed with everyone in that room. You keep trying. You try a different person. You say it louder or different words, or you find another way to show them something's wrong. Because somewhere, there's a Miss Linda who will notice. There's someone who will believe you. You just have to keep trying until you find them. Trying. The second grader nodded seriously, absorbing this wisdom from an 11-year-old who'd lived it, and Linda felt tears in her eyes because that was the truth, wasn't it? That persistence in asking for help could mean the difference between tragedy and survival. The relationship between Linda, Connor, and Elena evolved into something that looked like family, the chosen kind that forms when people's lives intersect at moments of crisis and then decide to stay connected. Linda attended Connor's school events, his soccer games, his art show exhibitions. Elena and Connor came to Linda's house for holidays when neither had other family in the area. They celebrated birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesdays when Linda made tamales and Connor brought his homework. It was a bond forged in the worst moment of their lives that had transformed into something sustaining and beautiful. Proof that trauma processed with support and love could become a foundation for connection rather than a wound that never healed. When Connor turned 16, he got his first job at that same Safeway, working as a courtesy clerk on weekends. He'd asked Linda if she thought it would be okay, if it might be weird given their history, and Linda had smiled and said she couldn't think of anything better than working alongside someone who understood the importance of paying attention. Connor started bagging groceries at Register 3 whenever Linda was working, and together they created an atmosphere of awareness and kindness that regular customers noticed and appreciated. Parents with young children gravitated toward their line because they could see that Linda and Connor really looked at kids, really listened when children spoke, really cared about creating a safe space. One Saturday afternoon, a girl about 8 years old came through their line with a man who claimed to be her uncle, but whose body language toward her felt wrong to both Linda and Connor. The girl was quiet, watchful, her eyes scanning the store the way Connor's eyes had scanned 5 years earlier. Connor made eye contact with her and asked gently if she was okay. if she needed anything. The girl looked at the man, then back at Connor, and said in a small voice that she wanted to call her mom. The man said quickly that her mom was busy, that they'd call later, but Connor had already pulled out his phone and handed it to the girl. "Here, you can use mine." "It's okay." The man's face went red, and he started to object. But Linda had already pressed the manager button, and within minutes they'd determined that the girl had been approached outside the store by a man claiming to be a family friend, that her mother had no idea where she was, and that what had looked like a shopping trip was actually an attempted abduction. The girl went home safe because Connor had recognized his own experience in her eyes, because he'd known what it felt like to need someone to notice and believe, and because Linda had created an environment where acting on concern was valued over avoiding awkwardness. The story made local news again, this time with the headline, "Former Kidnapping Victim Helps Save Girl." And Connor gave an interview where he said simply that Miss Linda had taught him to pay attention, and that paying attention was the most important thing any person could do for a child. That became Linda's legacy over the years that followed, not just the one dramatic rescue of Connor, but the culture of awareness she fostered wherever she went. She trained other Safeway employees to recognize signs of distress in customers, particularly children. She spoke at schools and community centers and church groups about the importance of trusting your instincts and acting when something feels wrong. She advocated for businesses to train their employees in basic child safety awareness, arguing that cashiers and store clerks and service workers were uniquely positioned to notice patterns and anomalies that might indicate danger. And she always told Connor's story, with his and Elena's permission, because it illustrated so perfectly that children in crisis are often desperately trying to communicate and need adults brave enough to receive that communication and act on it. When Linda retired from Safeway after 22 years, the store held a celebration attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched. Connor, now 18 and headed to college to study social work, gave a speech thanking Linda for seeing him when he needed to be seen, for believing him when he needed to be believed, and for teaching him that one person's attention and courage could change the trajectory of a life. He said that he'd chosen social work as a career because of Linda, because he wanted to spend his life being the person who noticed when others looked away, who acted when others hesitated, who created safety for vulnerable people the way Linda had created safety for him. Elena stood beside Connor during the speech, holding a framed photo of that first meeting in the Safeway manager's office. Connor drinking a juice box with Linda's hand on his shoulder, both of them looking exhausted but relieved. She presented it to Linda as a retirement gift, and said that image represented everything good about humanity, about strangers choosing to care, about communities protecting their most vulnerable members, about the power of really seeing another person and deciding their safety matters more than your comfort. Linda accepted the photo and the applause and the gratitude with characteristic humility, insisting she'd just done what anyone should do. But everyone in that room knew that wasn't quite true. Knew that plenty of people wouldn't have acted, wouldn't have listened, wouldn't have risked the social awkwardness of questioning an adult's relationship to a child. Linda had been different because she'd chosen to be, because she'd decided that her instincts about Connor's fear mattered more than avoiding a potential scene, and that single choice had saved a boy's life and taught an entire community about the importance of attention and action. The store installed a plaque near Register 3 after Linda retired, a small brass plate that read, "In honor of Linda Vasquez, who taught us that noticing matters, believing children matters, and acting when something feels wrong can save lives. Pay attention. Trust your instincts. Be brave." It stayed there for years, a quiet reminder to every employee and customer who passed through that ordinary grocery store that extraordinary things could happen when people chose to really see each other, when adults decided that children's fear deserved validation, when communities committed to protecting their most vulnerable members through awareness and courage. Connor visited that plaque every time he came home from college, touching it briefly before shopping, remembering the scared 6-year-old he'd been and the brave woman who'd chosen to listen. He thought about how different his life would have been if Linda had dismissed his statement, if she'd laughed along with Melissa, if she'd decided it wasn't her business. He thought about the parallel universe where no one noticed, or he'd ended up in California with a father who'd hurt his mother and a stepmother who'd proven herself willing to kidnap a child, where trauma would have compounded and safety would have remained forever compromised. And he felt overwhelming gratitude that he lived in this universe instead, the one where a cashier named Linda Vasquez had pressed a manager button and changed everything. The story of Connor and Linda became one of those tales that communities hold on to, that gets shared at safety trainings and parent meetings and anywhere people gather to talk about protecting children. It's a reminder that abductions and custody violations happen in broad daylight in ordinary places, that predators rely on social norms that make intervention uncomfortable, and that the best defense against child endangerment is a population of adults willing to notice, believe, and act. It's proof that children in danger are often sending signals that require attention and interpretation, that courage sometimes looks like a 6-year-old saying, "My real mom has brown hair," and that heroism sometimes looks like a cashier pressing a button and refusing to let something that feels wrong continue unchecked. If you've ever walked past a child who seemed scared, if you've ever dismissed your instinct that something felt wrong because you didn't want to make a scene, if you've ever wondered whether your observation could matter, Connor's story is your answer. One person's willingness to pay attention, to trust their gut, to value a child's safety over social comfort can mean the difference between a rescue and a tragedy. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their attention matters, that noticing is not the same as being nosy, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is believe a child who's trying to tell you something's wrong. Every community needs more people like Linda, more people willing to really see the children around them, more people brave enough to act when instinct says danger, even if the situation looks fine on the surface. Because somewhere right now, there's a child trying desperately to be noticed, hoping someone will see their fear and choose to help. Be that someone.